Today on the Perception in Action podcast, the first edition of the Perception in Action Journal Club, discussing the article Scaling Sports Equipment for Children Promotes Functional Movement Variability. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm joined by Marianne Davies and Ben Franks to discuss the really interesting new article by Tim Buzzard and colleagues from AIS. As I mentioned in the discussion, I think this is a really important article not only for youth sports coaching, but it also tests one of the fundamental ideas of the constraints-led approach. Namely, that varying constraints directly alters how a performer coordinates the degrees of freedom in movement. One quick note. In the episode, I refer to figures a few times, since we could show them on the video stream, without being conscious of the fact that I was going to release this as an audio-only podcast where you won't be able to see them. So I apologize for that, and will describe any visuals I use in the future episodes of this forum. I will definitely do more of these journal clubs in the future. Hi, everyone. I don't know if anyone's found us yet. Oh, looks like there's a couple. Oh, yeah, 4 people. That's pretty good for right away. So welcome to the first of many, I hope, Perception in Action Journal Club. The idea of this is, just to get a few people to together to talk about some interesting papers, and I'm going to record it and get some easy podcast material too. That's part of my goal. I think on YouTube and both on YouTube and Facebook, you can post comments and they'll show up to us. So if you have any questions or comments later on. So before we get to start on the article, I thought I'll go around the room, the virtual room. So see if we can start brief introduction of who we all are. So obviously I'm Rob Gray from Arizona State University and the Perception Action podcast. So Marianne, if you want to give a brief introduction. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Marianne Davies. So my background is primarily adventure sports as a coach developer, and I'm doing a PhD with Keith Davids and also with Jane Williams at Hartbury University, sort of exploring models of skill acquisition for equestrian sports coaching, obviously from an ecological dynamics perspective. And I'm also a senior coach developer with UK Coaching, which is very exciting.
Wow, that sounds like interesting stuff. Ben?
Mine's not as interesting as that, but I'm from Canterbury Christchurch University in the UK. I'm a part PhD, part teaching staff there, and most of our work kind of looks at perception action coupling in elite sports people. At the moment, my previous work was in goalkeepers for my masters. So I'm writing some bits up now with Will Roberts and Keith Davids. I'm currently doing my PhD around performance-based control and kind of really getting into nitty-gritty ecological stuff. But yeah, that's about it.
That's cool.
It's about as far as it's done at the moment as well.
That all sounds really good stuff. Yeah, I was just actually I'm trying to get Brett Fagan to come on and do an interview about affordance-based control, but he's too involved in administrative things right now. So eventually I'll get him on. Okay. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about, if I'm going to quickly, this paper that Scaling Sports Equipment for Children Promotes Functional Movement and Variability. It's by Tim Buzzard and Damien Farrow and all the colleagues at the AIS, Australian Institute of Sport, who do all that really awesome stuff. First of all, how cool is it that this paper got into Nature? Skill acquisition rate research doesn't always, especially one that uses real sports instead of something reaching, not that stuff doesn't have value. But so what I thought I would start off, maybe this is kind of a loaded question, but so what they did in the study obviously was to take kids and give them smaller rackets and different tennis balls to practice tennis. So I wanted to ask kind of a loaded question to start. Is this a constraints-led approach manipulation? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to say anything which changes some form of a parameter is technically constraint-led approach. So anything can be constraint-led approach. And I know that got shut down quite a lot, but
I would agree with that, because we're changing we're kind of changing the relationship between the performer and their environment through the equipment, through changing the equipment.
Yeah, no, I think that's I agree too. I think this is a great example of why in the word constraint is sometimes not the best, right? Because we're not actually limiting the kids. We're actually giving them more. They're giving them more opportunities. So it's a great example of constraining to afford, right? So by giving them, they're not taking away things. Well, maybe taking away reaching to a further ball because the racket's shorter. But so what kind, in the pyramid, what kind of constraint is this? Would you put it? It's probably an easy question, but.
Task.
Do we win points if we get these questions right?
I don't know. I don't know the answer, actually.
I'm just wondering if people tell us off if we get it wrong.
Yeah, I kick you off. Well, I find this a little bit confusing. Like some people are inconsistent. Well, I think the way I think of it doesn't agree with the way Carl. I would call it a task constraint too, equipment. But I think you described it perfectly, Marianne. It's really causing the interaction between individual and the task to change, right? So I think sometimes we put too much emphasis on categorizing it when it's these things all interact. So, so I guess do you want to give kind of an overall impression of what you thought about the study, maybe to start? Now that I've done my quiz, Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, I really like the paper. I'm going to try and be really critical of it just because it will help me understand it a bit more. But one of my bigger concerns were that in terms of this scaling equipment, how does that really transfer as if we look more longitudinally as they continue to grow and then end up using typical sports equipment? How does that initial learning phase of learning to these new constraints of the scaled equipment actually transfer later on down the line? That was my first observation that was under question. But in terms of the actual setup and studies, seems really effective. I like the use of the decompressed ball as well to kind of alter the coupling between the. I don't know, they briefly mentioned it, but don't really build on it briefly, but kind of a perceptual system as well, because there has to be that element of coupling between the perceptual and motor system. And it's also really clear the differences. I think in terms of multiple joint couplings, it's hard to argue against the findings, which is always nice to see, I think, in this style of research, especially where a forehand stroke is still kind of a novel skill to an extent. It's not massively dynamic or massively relying on loads of external properties. So it's interesting to see this big difference in still quite a relatively niche, small, novel task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. Marianne, do you have an initial?
Yeah, I likewise, I really like the paper. And like I say, I like the fact that it was really clear. I found it fascinating, the increase in the sort of coupling with the limbs as well. And that obviously releasing degrees of freedom. And it kind of made me think about part of that could possibly also be psychological as well. You know, it's sometimes quite hard to unpick all those different bits. But from my perspective, it really made me think about the experiences I have, particularly with things like paddle sports, where there are sort of not such set equipment, so you can buy different boats and paddles and things, etc. And just how different performance is and certainly as a woman or somebody who's not kind of built like your average Olympian, and realizing that's how they create the boats, and what they do is they scale them to size, which kind of made me think a little bit more about this rather than scale to proportions. So when I first worked with Canoe Wales, I was really lucky to spend some time with one of the guys that designed the Piranha boats. And the first thing they did was move my seat forward and put a little booster cushion on it. so that I had more weight above my boat instead of inside it. As a typical woman, I've not got such big shoulders, and I'm kind of got more weight down. And the difference was phenomenal. So even though my weight was correct, my build wasn't. So the scaling wasn't just to size. And the same with the first time I had a mountain bike that was designed for women. I went, oh, that can't really make much difference. But it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think those are great points. I think you both raised really good points, Ben. The transfer of what happens when you go back to regular adult size equipment. You know, as far as I know, none of the studies, like there's quite a few studies on scaling equipment for kids, right? But as far as I know, and no one's looked at that. And I also think the point about it's not just the size, it's actually the scale and the arrangement. Because I believe there's one scaling study where they actually used, I think, 4 different rackets and they tried to match it based on the kid's height, but it was too simple. It's not that simple, like you were saying. It's not just size. So, yeah, and so in this study, I think the methodology, right? They were just doing tossing. Were they just hand tossing the ball to the?
Yeah. Underarm.
Yeah, and they were doing 4-hand strokes in a biomechanics lab, within subjects design with and without, with a smaller racket and a less compressed ball, and because compared to an adult racket and a regular tennis ball. Yeah. I don't know. Do they give any? I can't remember. Are there any instructions at all to the? Obviously, I don't think these are complete novices, right? They played tennis before.
I think it was to hit a target.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it?
But what I meant is, have they had any coaching at all about how to swing a tennis racket? Like any kind of the traditional explicit, you know? So it's not purely here, pick this up and hit the ball. I think they have had some normal, traditional coaching before this. Yeah.
Yeah, they've all come from Tennis Australia's Hot Shots program. So some kind of coaching centre thing. Mm-hmm. So they know what tennis is by the sounds of things.
Yeah. So it's not like pure novices starting out with self-organization completely. Obviously, they've had some foundation. Let me kind of try to share my screen a bit so we can. I think there's not much else to the actual methods. I think it's pretty straightforward, right? It's all really in the analysis, I think. So let me see if I can put up, if I can get this to work. Okay, there's my. Oh, there we go. Fancy. Okay. So I put up, so this is, so a lot of what they were measuring, let me go. I think this is, a lot of what they were measuring was the variability, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I would recommend if you're reading a paper and is really you have to be clear what kind of variability are you talking about, right? Is it the variability between shots? Like, so if you take, between shots within one person, between the group of people, like you take the or within a single stroke, right? So, so this is one of the really nice figures. So this is what they were doing is plotting the variance in the forearm and the upper arm, right? And I think this was within a tennis stroke, right? Yeah. And so what they're showing there, they're really in this paper, they're really framing this all in terms of Bernstein's degree of freedom problem, right? You have to figure out what you need to do with your upper arm and your forearm, and coordinate them in some way. And what they're basically showing there. So, do you want to, Marianne? Do you want to kind of talk through one of these figures? Is there anyone kind of that caught your eye in particular?
I think what really came across to me there was that how the shoulder was released obviously more in the scaling one, so they were able to move more fluidly, and they had that coupling of the shoulder and the forearm rather than just holding the shoulder still and trying to just move the forearm to control what happened with the ball. And that was like I said, that was really interesting, because part of that can be feeling, there can also be an psychological aspect to that, feeling more confident. You just kind of relax a little bit as well. So, but it was really, that for me, that was really interesting, especially kind of one of the things I'm really interested is in how do we promote an earlier uncoupling of those freezing degrees of freedom.
Yeah, I agree. And if I remember correctly, a lot of the original studies, not only do they have a performance benefit, so you hit more winners, you hit harder, but I think there's also kind of strategical, like you're saying, psychological. They hit the ball earlier, they play more aggressive shots, they hit in front of the baseline more. So I think you're right. It's more to it than just a coordination change, right? How about you, Ben?
The bit I quite like that's been drawn out of this is where, I know a lot of the arguments against self-organization is that nothing can just be randomly spontaneous. But the point they make around how the upper and forearm kind of coupledness in relation to the angle of the tennis racket or the distance of the tennis racket. So it's still organized around that kind of set parameter still. Mm-hmm. So how they self-organize based on that, you can even call it a constraint, to still get that kind of functional movement variability with the scaled equipment as well. I don't know if they had that in a figure, did they?
Yeah, I'm trying to find. So this one, I just mentioned, the way that I interpret this one. So this is the variability in your forearm position versus the variability in your upper arm. And basically what you see is the blue triangles, and basically your forearm isn't varying, right? The points are almost in a perfect vertical line, right? So that's where their evidence of freezing, right? The person is choosing not to do anything with their forearm, right? They're basically doing the same thing all through the whole thing. Yeah. What they're doing instead is, and with scaling, right? And they're doing everything is involved in the upper arm, right? With the blue dots, which has a huge variance, right? But when they switch to the scale, you have both things involved, right? So that's a really, really nice, clear example of going from freezing to freeing, right? You're using the forearm way more than you did before, and so there's two things. You're using a different joint more, and you're right, Marion. It's coupled, right? They're nice, high correlate. They're correlated with each other. They're moving together. I think the one you were talking about, maybe this one where you have the actual kind of shoulder to racket, or were you talking about? Yeah.
The distance, yeah.
Yeah. This is so. If we're going to get critical, we should critique these papers. This is one of these almost. It's bordering on these kind of figures that people make fun of when they try to do a correlation. Right, that's a really questionable thing to fit a straight line to, the red thing, right? That doesn't look very linear to me. I understand what they were doing, but it looks like there's something more complicated going on than a linear relationship, right?
It almost looks like two clusters, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. That there's a little vector.
Yeah, and they do to be fair, they do go on to do more than correlations, but that is a kind of a questionable fit there, even though it's significant. Yeah. So this again just kind of basically showing the same thing, where when you have the scaled equipment, you're taking in both joints. You're using freeing. Is this the one I don't know if this was the one you're kind of talking about as well. I like this one's really cool too. This is kind of showing the actual swing from start to hitting the ball. So the blue one is when you're using the full size racket. So this is state space essentially, right? This is all the possible places your body could be to do this task, and here's where you choose to do it with a full size racket. It just looks so it looks so you're not using all the available state, right, to do the task. You're using a really narrow range of options, whereas this one wow, you're really opened up and exploring the environment. Whether, maybe that doesn't always use, results in better performance, but in this case it does. Yeah.
And that visual line on the blue one just looks really constrained, doesn't it? It looks like it's being really controlled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what they're trying to show in this this little graph here. That it's because you're free. You're doing everything with one part of the body.
Yeah.
And at first until the very end when you have to kick in the other part. Yeah.
So in terms of why that happens, so say I'm a tennis coach. I've never ever played tennis ever, but is that because they have the ability to freeze because they're afforded more possibilities from the racket being bigger and having a bigger surface area, so they can get away with doing less with their body because the size of the racket affords them the ability to almost be lazy in terms of the actual movements they deliver?
That's interesting, because my interpretation would be that they're unable to control it as well. So they're needing to give themselves as little as possible to try and control. So they'll freeze as many of the degrees of freedom as they can, maybe because it's a little more cumbersome or they're not confident about it. It's like me playing golf. The only thing I move is my wrist. Like the rest of me doesn't move. Otherwise, I just take out a chunk of the grass, But it's because I haven't got the ability to control all of those different degrees of freedom.
Yeah. I'm just thinking the nature of the setup, where it's an underarm throw to a point, and a forearm could just be literally a forearm movement if the serve is relatively stable in terms of the underarm throw goes to a similar position. They could get away with just moving the forearm and relying on the racket.
Yeah.
Just wonder what design causes some of this.
Yeah, I guess that's a fair question. What kind of feedback are they getting, right? Maybe you're right. Sometimes this is called, the term people use is satisficing, right? Maybe if there's really, they're not playing a match, all they're doing is, I guess they're hitting a target, right? So they're getting feedback about how effective. But you're right. Yeah. Maybe it's just the forearm is good enough, right? There's not much. Are you kind of getting at maybe a motivation? You don't have much motivation to try different things?
Possibly, and just to solve the task really easily, just moving the forearm in a very limited way with a normal size racket may be able to solve the task quite easily with that limited movement. And if it's the more scaled equipment, maybe require them to be more, let's say, active, but maybe.
So
for example.
If the scaled equipment requires them to have to put more power in, that perhaps would work.
Possibly. I'm just thinking about the method itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's those are great questions. Why do you freeze and why do you freeze? What is the actual stimulus, right? Is it something? Is it kind of motivational? You see, that you're not doing effectively, and you change. We probably wouldn't think in most cases it's conscious, right? I'm not gonna move my arm. You probably really can't do that in most cases, but and then or is it just kind of more giving you more? You just suddenly pick up the smaller racket and you can swing it in different ways, and so it leads you to trying different things. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and with maybe a slower bouncing ball, and it bounced lower, didn't it? So they could reach it. Gives them a lot more time as well, and maybe feels as if it's going to be more attainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think these are all good points, right? It's more than just a coordinate. This having more options for the action. I think there's still a human being attached to it, right? That has to decide all this. Yeah. Is there any other ones?
I don't know whether this is would be of interest, but one of the things I do a lot in paddling, especially if people have sort of developed a particular way of doing something, so maybe a particular paddle stroke is that I will give them a paddle that actually doesn't allow them to do that anymore. So maybe a wing paddle or just a single blade instead of a double one. So I'm changing that equipment. It's kind of a little bit like the scaling so that it disrupts what they do normally. Mm-hmm. They have to sort of search for a slightly different solution, but it's not hugely different. It's just a little bit different. So I might weight it, for example, which would be like, I'll give them a longer or a shorter one.
Yeah, no, that's a good. Yeah, I think that's more of an example of what people kind of think with the constraints, where you take something away. And I kind of agree with you, Ben, too. I'm not sure. I don't play enough tennis to know what would happen when you do this. If you tried to swing exactly the same way with a smaller racket and a decompressed ball, what would happen? I'm not sure.
I just wonder whether have they used scaled equipment before? So if anything, the normal size racket was actually the intervention, and therefore caused a more stable, almost novice-like response to using that equipment. Hence the freezing of certain degrees of freedom.
Yeah. Or if it's more responsive, like the ball bounces more, that's what I'm trying to get to, that it responds more, then they're likely to constrain what they do a little bit. Whereas if they're the softer ball, they can sort of like, they've got more, there's a little bit more variance is taken up by them giving it a good whack, whereas the bouncy ball, they're going to be aware that they can't get away with it as much.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fair point. Yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think they're both points. And I think the next step, obviously, that we're kind of missing here is the learning piece, right? Seeing how it changes from these two states over time. Obviously, you can't do everything. I hate when people do a great paper and people just, why didn't you do this and that? And especially in a nature one where they give you a super word limit. So, but that's obviously the next, trying to map, understanding how you go from one to the other. You're right, Ben. Where did they start? This is really measuring performance with these two pieces of constraints rather than how constraints shape skill acquisition. Yeah. I don't know if there's any. I think that's I don't know if there's any. There's one other. There's a bit of extra material you can go online and get for this that I kind of pulled out. This one figure, just is showing. It's interesting. I'm always interested, like how these things change across the course of the actual movement. They did a really nice job showing kind of how the two things are balanced with each other. I think this is what this figure is trying to show. The bottom one is the scaled, and going along zero basically means the two things are upper arm and forearm are doing equal work. Right? It's not till the very end that one kind of takes over, whereas in the standard one, right from the start, one is taking over again. So they do a nice job of showing this kind of this freeing thing in multiple different ways. I think the other one in kind of these measure these vectors. Right? They show how you can the scaled one has equal contribution. The word I would use, you said coupling, Marianne. It's a motor synergy too, right? The two things are working together to compensate for each other. Whereas in the blue one in the bottom, it's almost all the forearm, right? There's a shift.
Yeah, I think for me that was the thing that was really interesting in it, because I guess, and this is it would be interesting with your question, Ben, that if they by getting used to having a much more coupled movement pattern, hopefully even when they do transfer to a sort of full size bit of equipment, that they've developed a coordination pattern. They've had the opportunity to develop a more functional coordination pattern that involves more of their body.
Oh, I think we lost. Oh, there's. No, I think that's right. And do you find that, Marianne, in your manipulations when you do change the, positioning, or you mentioned taking away with a different paddle, after you give them the other equipment back, does it kind of change the way they use the regular equipment? Do you find kind of transfer effect?
Yeah, they're usually just much more confident and playful with it. Mm-hmm. And again, it's really difficult sort of unpicking the reasons, but I think just by, learning to use something slightly different, and some of it's psychological, letting go of having to do something maybe that they thought they had to, trying to adhere to some technical template that they've been coached in the past. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of little bits in there, but yes, generally, and I do encourage a much more playful way of being. So one of the things is, sort of like when it's disrupted, they're not worried about their performance, because they know that I've kind of like I've changed it so that there's sort of like less pressure, mm-hmm. if that makes sense. So
yeah, definitely. Yeah. You've kind of moving it away from the competition environment, although we say, that's less representative maybe, but it lets people relax a bit more, feel like they can play around. I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And usually when they go back, I don't think I've ever had anyone that doesn't go back and just be much more playful and competent with what they've had before, or change it, or go, actually, this isn't the right size paddle for me. I'm going to, maybe the equipment I'm using isn't as good as it could be. So, but there's a beauty of that sport that that you can change those things. But definitely, I think almost we have to unconstrain people's minds as much as their bodies.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, it's that sometimes the term psychological safety, right? You got to let people feel it's comfortable to make mistakes and mess around, and not always be perfect. Ben, and
not be locked into a technical template they thought they had to use. Exactly.
Yeah. It's hard not to get out of that mindset. Ben, you're kind of what can we talk about this paper in terms of affordances? I don't know if they really mention anything in terms of affordances in the paper.
No, they don't really. They try to be quite theoretically neutral to an extent. I think they're quite clever with that.
Yeah, maybe that was a response to reviewers. You never know.
Nature though.
Yeah, definitely. Whatever you have to do.
Absolutely.
I think affordance is an interesting one, because possibly, if you freeze degrees of freedom, you'd argue that perhaps there's less affordances to maybe take advantage of, but I guess just like more channeled towards a less broad solution bandwidth or solution manifold. So maybe there's less to act on. That's some of the stuff coming out of some of the stuff I'm writing at the moment is around experts having these quite broad perceptual motor solution bandwidth, so how they can be successful within like a spectrum of different behaviors. So I'm going to deviate a little bit, but
the stuff I'm doing is
on the quietile. Mm-hmm. And the quietile has been assumed to be there's this optimal timings of the kind of final fixation. But what we found with some expert goalkeepers in more representative tasks is that they can kind of operate in these bandwidths where the timing is kind of irrelevant, as long as it's within these kind of parameters of within X percentage and Y percentage based on, theoretically speaking, what they're able to do. So I think Matt Dix and his work started to push this in terms of a quicker goalkeeper will have a slightly different timing of their fixation to a slower goalkeeper based on how they interact with that environment. So it's interesting here in terms of scaling that equipment and what that does to the affordances that are able to be acted upon. Mm-hmm. And it's I just wonder whether there could be a slightly more individualized analysis of this in terms of the scaling against the actual anthropometrics of each individual. I mean, I'm asking a bit too much of the paper.
No, I think that's a really, really interesting approach. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know some people have kind of critiqued the quiet eye as, it's basically teaching one technique, right? You have to look for this long, which kind of goes against a lot of self-organization. So I think that's an interesting concept. Yeah, I think the affordance, I don't know. I think part of the, the stuff you were talking about, Marianne, people changing their strategy, like playing the ball earlier in front of the baseline. You could argue those are all afforded things by the new racket. Maybe it's something as simple. You can just, if it's lighter, you can just swing it faster, right? If you have a faster swing, you don't need as much time to set up. You can get to different places, right? So you can imagine it's affording different things. We got a question from somebody. Someone was asking, I don't know if any of us has played with this, is looking at using kind of an overload constraint. So using heavier than normal, maybe paddle in your case, baseball bat in my case, or kind of asking what's kind of the sweet spot in terms of how much heavier. I don't know if anyone has any, do we want to, yeah.
I've certainly used that. Actually, the most time I use something like that is actually to create drag on a boat. So even sort of putting something like a tire or something behind to pull. But what that does is allow someone to connect through the body and use much more of their body. Mm-hmm. So again, it's kind of I've never thought of it as unfreezing degrees of freedom, but it sort of creates a connectivity because you have to then actually use your entire body and connect from your feet right through to your hands. Whereas if there's no resistance, you can just just use a little bit. And so those degrees of freedom, like Ben was saying, you can get away with it. Mm-hmm. So powering up and using a weight sort of almost forces the system to recruit more of the coordination in order to be able to resolve that problem. And I use that a lot to create connectivity.
I don't think there's nothing on really practitioner guidelines of if you are going to scale equipment of how much by or to what extent or in relation to what other variables. Mm-hmm. I guess just throw some things at the environment and see what happens, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. I've done a bit with, heavier bats and things like that. The only observation I can contribute is, sometimes what I found is it can be unnoticeable almost to the person consciously and still have effects on their actual, how they coordinate and things. So you don't have to go super heavy right away, I think. And obviously you want to be careful with that in certain sports. So, I'd start small. I guess if you really know what you want to change, like you were talking about, Marianne, then maybe you can do some sort of calculation. But other than that, you're right, Ben, just guess.
Yeah. And I guess it's thinking about what you're getting out of it. What is it that will get the learner to search? What perceptual motor workspace do they need to explore by you doing that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. You're right. And I think, like I always try to, that's what differentiates the constraints-led approach from pure differential learning for me. It's, and that's why I would call this constraints. It's not differential learning. Obviously, you're changing the racket specifically to try to achieve something. Yeah.
Change. Yeah.
Yeah. To try to open up affordances. Yeah. So maybe wrapping up, so I think I picked this article. I like this article because not only is I don't think it just applies to developmental issues in kids. I think it's a good test of one of the main arguments of the constraints-led approach, right? What we should see when you add constraints. So I think it really does advance. Everyone complains about where's the evidence for the constraints-led approach. I'm like, give us time, and I think this is a good step. Yeah. So I don't know. Do you have any kind of general comments about this area and kind of how this fits in or where we need to go?
I'd like to preempt a question that I know might be fired at this.
Okay.
Is what does this look like longitudinally? Mm-hmm. And it's a fair criticism. There's not a great deal of longitudinal stuff looking at the impact of constraints on self-organizing tendencies or changing the perceptual motor landscape, etc. So what does this look like in terms of also appreciating the more organismic or individual personal constraints over time, as well as kind of the more immediate actual task constraints impacting the performer environment system basically immediately. So how do you kind of balance those two?
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Those are both. I think part of the issue is those are really challenging things to measure. I know I'm struggling with this now too. Everything I learned about research and statistics falls out the window when trying to measure and quantify individual learning. Right? It's so difficult, and I think that's part of the thing you see here. With me picking on their correlation. You see there's a lot more going on there, and we're trying to wrench it into, the things we know. And the methods that are out there they're pretty challenging unless you're a math wizard, like uncontrolled manifold analysis or something. It's pretty hard to just pick up and do. I think those are great points. I think, other people might, a wonderful thing to see, I would have loved to see, and again, I hate when people do this, but adding wish you had done more in your paper is what would this look like if you had one with just instructions? Here's an adult racket. I want you to swing it like this. Expert coach. Would you see similar changes in the coordination pattern? Would you or not? I think that's these kind of direct comparisons of methods too. I think we need more of as well.
Maybe to touch on some of the more maybe attentional focus stuff and look at more of the psychological aspect as well, then it becomes a bit more integrated and slightly more coupled.
Yeah.
So how about you, Marianne? Do you have any kind of general?
I think again, sort of go back to sort of where I was thinking when I started, and and I think it's maybe just being a woman and spending a lot of my time, using equipment and stuff that's not designed for me. That this is great that it's in kids, but also it really applies to that whole concept that scaling and it's that it's really interesting the other areas that it can be applied to. And I'm kind of thinking it's a shame that when they started, making certainly adventure sports equipment and clothing for women, because we couldn't even move in the kit that we had before, because I'm not the same shape as the average bloke. But that somebody wasn't doing research on the effect that had, because I kind of go like, suddenly there's a lot more women are paddling and they're getting better at it and things, and how much of that is the fact that the kit was actually just something they weren't having a fight with, and how much of it was that there were other people in there. And
I think that's really interesting. I kind of got a taste of that when I first started doing driving research, like safety issues with having women, average sized women closer to the front of a car, with the airbag, not changing the airbag. And so I think there's really a lot of things that applies to. So, I think that was a good first attempt at this. Thank you very much, guys, for coming. I was watching, I think we had at least 25 people watching at one point. So that's pretty good. So I hope how are you guys holding up in the stay at home, whatever you want to call it, environment?
I'm thinking I might start learning how to play golf, because I've been quarantined at my family's place, which is fabulous, but there's a bike park and a pump track and the horses and the show jumping, and I'm thinking, I'm not supposed to be doing that in case I get injured. And then there's this beautiful golf course that's empty outside my window, and I've never been interested in golf, so I'm contemplating.
I had the exact same thought, actually. There's a golf course across the road from me, and I keep looking out, and you see the people. As long as you stay away from the 19th hole, the bar, right? Golf is like a perfect sport for this, right? You have small groups of people that know each other that are separated by yards and yards of fair. So
I'm not at high risk of being injured and having to be taken to A&E and explain why I was doing something I wasn't supposed to be.
Okay, thanks very much, guys, and I'll definitely try to organize another one of these sometime soon. And if anyone listening is interested in being one of the discussants next time, please contact me in some way. So I think we'll sign off for now, and I'll be releasing this as a podcast later on. So thanks, guys. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.
Straight away.